When we talk about the advent of Europeans in India, we start with the arrival of the Portuguese for trade on the Malabar coast at the end of the 15th century. But even before the 15th century, India had well-established trade relations with Europe. Then, why was the arrival of the Portuguese so important? Today, we will talk about the trade between India and Europe before the 15th century, what led to the Portuguese arrival on the Indian coast, and how did they fare in their initial years in India. As I mentioned before, India has had a flourishing trade relationship with Europe since ancient times. By the Middle Ages, trade between India and Europe was carried along three prominent routes. The first one was a sea route along the Persian Gulf, followed by an overland journey through modern-day Iraq and Turkey, followed by a trip through the sea to Venice and Genoa. The second route was through the Red Sea, followed by an overland journey to Alexandria in Egypt, and then a sea trip to reach Venice and Genoa. The final third route was a scantily used overland route through India's northwest frontier passes across Central Asia and Russia to the Baltic. If you notice, all the trade that was taking place in Europe and the Mediterranean were concentrated in Venice and Genoa. This meant that the trade in this part of the world was almost a monopoly of the Italians. And who dominated the Asian part of the trade? It was the Arab merchants and sailors. But then, was the trade in these routes seamless? The answer is no. The traders and trade items were vulnerable to pirates and natural calamities. Also, items in transit from Asia to Europe passed through several hands and regions. Each region had its own taxing and duty system. In spite of all these natural and man-made hurdles, trade was highly profitable. So, what was the reason behind it? The reason was never-ending demand for Eastern silk, spices, and calicos in the European markets. Spices, especially, were something which the Europeans could do little without. This was because they survived on salted and peppered meat during the winters. And since there was little grass to feed the cattle with, this use of spices made the meat tolerable. In fact, European food was as spicy as Indian food till the 1800s. This was how trade between India and Europe was conducted and controlled before the 15th century. But the things changed by the mid-15th century. The Ottoman Turks captured Constantinople in 1453. The consequent rise in prominence of the Turks in Asia Minor shifted the control of the old trading routes connecting the East and the West. In addition to this, the nations of Western Europe, especially Spain and Portugal, were also eyeing trade with India and Indonesia. But the monopolization of the European trade routes by the Italians was also frustrating for the new nation states of Western Europe, especially Spain and Portugal. These Western European nations hardly had any share in trade through these old trading routes. But the trade with India and Indonesia was very lucrative to be given up so easily. So the Western European nations started looking for new routes in the 15th century. Their aim was to bypass Turkish hostility, break the monopoly of the Arabs and Italians, and establish a new direct trade route to the east. This was also when Europe was transitioning from the Middle Ages to the modern age, also known as Renaissance period. The Renaissance was a social, political, economic, and cultural revolution that encouraged the Europeans to be curious about the world. This led to the exploration of the regions beyond their knowledge. One of the best examples is obviously the discovery of America. The discovery of America was coupled with advancements in shipbuilding and navigation. What was the significance of these navigational discoveries? They opened a new chapter in world history. Adam Smith, the famous economist, was of the opinion that the discovery of America and Cape of Good Hope in Africa, which allowed for an alternate route to India, were the two greatest and the most important events recorded in the history of mankind. Moreover, the 15th century was also the time of economic development in Europe. With an increase in land cultivation, improved plowing techniques, scientific crop management systems like crop rotation, and also the increased supply of meat brought greater prosperity. This also spiked the demand for Oriental luxury items such as silk, cotton, porcelain, spices, and others. We know that Venice and Genoa were centers of trade and they prospered through trade in the Oriental commodities. But were they powerful enough to monopolize trade through the entire old trade route? Could they take up major explorations on their own? The answer to both the questions is no. Neither were they big enough to take on the Ottoman Turks, nor were they big enough to take any major explorations. We already know that the Portuguese and the Spanish were looking for new sea routes, and in their quest, they were aided financially and also with manpower by other North European states. The Genoese were readily providing them with the ships and the technical know-how. Along with their quest for a new sea route, the Portuguese had assumed a leading role in the Christian resistance to Islam. Prince Henry of Portugal was obsessed to find a new ocean route to India, which earned him a nickname, the Navigator. He was eager to find a route that would bypass the Muslims in the Eastern Mediterranean to reach India. He also wanted to discover all the routes that connected Europe to India. This obsession was further fed by Pope Nicholas V. How? In 1454, just a year after the fall of Constantinople to Ottoman Turks who were followers of Islam, he gave Prince Henry a bull. With this token, the Pope bestowed him with the honor to navigate the sea to the distant shore of the Orient, especially as far as India. The whole idea behind exploring the distant shores of the Orient was also an endeavor to fight Islamic dominance and spread Christianity. So, you see, their government had a vested interest in voyages to the distant lands. Portugal and Spain encouraged their seamen to venture via the open seas. In fact, these exploration journeys were government controlled and sponsored. Since the Portuguese and the Spanish were equally vested in exploration, the discovery of America in 1492 created a conflict with respect to the distribution of resources between the two nations. To avoid further conflicts like this, the Treaty of Tordesillas was signed in 1494 between Portugal and Spain. By virtue of this treaty, the non-Christian world was divided into two by an imaginary line in the Atlantic around 1,300 miles west of the Cape Verde Islands. Everything across the east of the line would be occupied and claimed by the Portuguese. Similarly, everything west of the line could be claimed and occupied by the Spanish. Hence, the Portuguese came to India. The first Portuguese venture to the east was done by Bartolomé Diaz in 1487. He rounded the Cape of Good Hope in Africa and sailed up to its eastern coast. He was convinced that he found the much coveted sea route to India. But as we all know, that wasn't the case. Only 10 years later, in 1497, another expedition of Portuguese ships set sail for India under the expertise of Vasco da Gama. The ships were led by a Gujarati pilot named Abdul Majid. They arrived at Calicut in May 1498 in a little less than 11 months' time. They were welcomed by the Hindu ruler of Calicut, the Zamorin or Samudri. In no way could the Zamorin comprehend that the small incident would alter the course of the history of the Indian subcontinent. Calicut was a very prosperous town because of its position as a trading port. The Arabs, who already had a flourishing trade there, were suspicious of the Portuguese interest in the Malabar coast. And they were right, because the Portuguese wanted to have a monopoly over the very profitable eastern trade. They also wanted to exclude the Arabs. But were the Arabs the only ones trading via the Indian Ocean? No. Indians, Africans, Chinese, Javanese, and others were also trading via the Indian Ocean. But these people followed some very clear rules and did not fight for dominance as such. They were all in for the profit, except for the Portuguese. They wanted complete dominance. When Vasco da Gama finally returned to Portugal, his cargo was valued 60 times the cost of his voyage. The Europeans also understood the significance of direct trade, and that for the same amount of pepper, they were paying 10 times more to the Muslim middlemen. This scenario was also tempting for other profit-seeking European nations. Pedro Alvarez Cabral, also regarded as the discoverer of Brazil, established the first Portuguese factory in the Indian subcontinent in Calicut in September 1500. He came to trade for spices and to establish a factory. But setting up a factory so many miles away from his home country wasn't an easy task. He and his crew were attacked by the locals. Some of them even lost their lives. He retributed by confiscating several Arab ships and killed hundreds of their crew, along with capturing their cargo and setting their ships ablaze. He also bombarded Calicut. Despite these, he was able to get into several advantageous treaties with the local rulers of Kochi and Cananore. In 1501, Vasco da Gama came to India once again. This time, the Zamorin was not very welcoming and refused to favor the Portuguese over the Arabs. This didn't go well with Gama. So, he took advantage of the internal conflicts between the Indian rulers. In this case, he meddled between the rulers of Calicut and Kochi. With this, he fell out with Zamorin completely and wreaked havoc on Arab shipping. The Portuguese also brutally killed hundreds of Arab merchants and seamen. Despite his fallout with the Zamorin, Vasco da Gama set up a factory at Cananore. Cananore, Calicut, Kochi, and Ceylon, also known as Kollam, became the important trading centers for the Portuguese in India. They were also successful in fortifying their factories and trading activities. With the opening of America and improved trade relations between Asia and Europe, world trade also saw a boom in the 17th and 18th centuries. America, rich in precious metals, gold and silver, fueled European trade. It provided the much required capital needed by the European nations to advance in science, technology, trade, and industry. America also became an inexhaustible market for European goods. But the opening of America generated a demand for labor as well. and this demand was fulfilled by Africans. But before we get into that, here is some context. Around the mid-15th century, the Europeans made their entry into Africa. This event contributed to early capital accumulation for the development of European countries. What initially attracted the Europeans was the abundance of gold and ivory in Africa, but their interest soon shifted towards the slave trade. In the 16th century, the Spanish and the Portuguese dominated the slave trade, but it was later taken over by the Dutch, French, and British traders. For years after 1650, thousands of Africans were sold into slavery in West Indies, North America, and South America. There were slave ships that carried manufactured goods from Europe to Africa and exchanged them for the natives on the coast of Africa. These ships then took the slaves across the Atlantic Ocean to exchange them for the colonial produce of plantations or mines. The colonial produce was then sold in the European mainland, and this was known as the triangular trade, which was responsible for the commercial supremacy of England and France. Slaves were in great demand in cotton, sugar, and tobacco plantations and mines. The demand for slaves was inexhaustive, as the harsh conditions and their brutal treatment led to their high mortality rates. The small European population could not have supplied the cheap labor that was required for the absolute exploitation of lands and mines of the New World. Historians estimate that the number of Africans sold into slavery runs between unimaginable numbers of 15 to 50 million. The transportation of slaves to the New World and their death eventually led to the weakening of the African countries and their societies. A significant portion of the North American and European prosperity was based on the slave trade and slave labor. These profits also financed the Industrial Revolution in the 18th and 19th centuries. India and other colonies also played a similar role later. Slavery was abolished in the 19th century after it failed to play an important economic role. But it was defended and praised for as long as it was profitable. Slavery was supported by monarchs, ministers, members of parliaments, dignitaries of the church, leaders of public opinion, industrialists, and merchants alike. Some prominent individuals supporting slavery in Britain included Queen Elizabeth, George III, Edmund Burke, Horatio Nelson, William Ewart Gladstone, Benjamin Disraeli, and Thomas Carlyle.